scripture for the message is Acts 14, verses 1 through 7. Now at Iconium, Paul and Barnabas entered together into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number, both of Jews and Greeks, believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles, and they harmed the souls of them against the brethren. Yet they remained there for a sufficient time, speaking boldly for the Lord, who bore witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. The people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews, and some sided with the apostles. When an attempt was made by both Jews and Gentiles with their rulers to mistreat them and to stone them, they learned of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities in Lycaonia, and to the surrounding country. And there they continued to preach the gospel. May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. A lot of people would just like to forget that 2020 happened, and others, though, seem to speak of last year as a battle we're still waging and in need of courage and wisdom in order to win. In the church, I think at least, that we can speak of a battle, but we've got to be careful about what kind of battle we're actually talking about. We want to enter into the right battle. Outward circumstances like the pandemic or, for example, wars or natural disasters, those things all come and go, and we certainly don't deny them. We've been trying to take them seriously, as hopefully all last year has shown, but our focus, however, is on a deeper level. We look at a battle line where we ask, in the midst of these outward circumstances like the pandemic, what harm is being done to people's souls? Here we still need a spiritual courage and wisdom as we ask to become God's instruments, to speak openly for the Lord. This is what our text, I think, is lifting up for us as Paul and Barnabas have asked to be God's instruments, and they are showing signs of spiritual courage and wisdom. They arrive in Iconium, and as usual, they first go to the synagogue, and the result is a great multitude of Jews and Greeks believe. But now, the outward circumstances take a harsh turn. The unbelieving Jews, it says, roused up and harmed the souls of the Gentiles against the brethren. Now, that wasn't just contradicting their message, but it meant that they were harming the souls of those who heeded this contradictory message by the unbelievers. And here we start to see spiritual courage. In spite of this opposition, it says, therefore, they spent sufficient time there, openly speaking for the Lord, who was witnessing by the word of his grace, and granting signs and wonders to occur through their hands. So they decide, as the opposition increases, because they're looking for the harm in people's souls, they know they need to stay a sufficient time there. Now the outward situation worsens. The whole town is divided into two camps, some with the Jews and some with the apostles. The conflict reaches its peak when there occurred an attempt of the Jews and Gentiles with their rulers in order to abuse and stone Paul and Barnabas. Now that attempt, as is translated here, is literally translated a rushing headlong. The Gentiles and the Jews and their rulers are rushing headlong towards Paul and Barnabas in order to abuse and stone them. In other words, to me, that's a mob mentality. They're no longer able to endure any kind of appeal to reason. You can't say anything that would change their minds. And on the other hand, in the meanwhile, the new believers, they're established and they're not in danger of turning to the other side because this mob mentality has exposed the darker spirit behind that side. So Paul and Barnabas take this as a sign of a call to move into a new region, Lystra and Derbe, where they were preaching the gospel. So Paul and Barnabas looked at the battle line where souls were being harmed. They stayed among them. They spoke openly for the Lord, as the Lord spoke and worked through them, until those harmed souls were sufficiently prepared for the conflict that they would have to face and that we all have to face. This same conflict is what we will experience in 2021. Different outward circumstances, to be sure, but the battle line is still drawn at the door of people's souls. Will we battle spiritually and speak openly for the Lord? Let's hear an example from a man named John Bonnell. This was one of his first recollections of there even being such a battle, and it happened while he was a seminary student. It was in a small town of Rinshaw, Nova Scotia, and John took an internship as a summer preacher for the town. This was the only time of year that they actually had a preacher. The town and the church were so small. He remembered riding his second-hand bike along a bumpy road and getting caught in the middle of a downpour and thunderstorm. Ahead of him was a little barefoot girl sloshing across a wooden bridge and was crying. So John tried to use humor as he approached her. "Shouldn't you stop crying? The bridge is wet enough already." He brought out a collapsible umbrella that he had carried with him, and he put it over her and had her sit up on the handlebars, and he awkwardly tried to continue to hold the umbrella and to ride the bike with one hand down the hill. "And what house should I stop at?" "Second one on the right," she said. "What's your name?" "Mary. My father is Frank Sanders. Does that mean I have to get off?" Well, John was still trying to process that strange question. They arrived at Mary's house. Mary's mother was in the doorway and told her to go in. She was tall and gaunt, he said, and seemed to be very poor. He said the flush of life was gone from her face, and yet there was in her eyes the memory of a happiness now gone. "How did you happen to have an umbrella when it's been sunny all day?" she asked suspiciously. "Well, I'm the summer preacher, and we prayed for rain at the prayer meeting the other night, so I thought I'd better carry one with me," he said. She motioned him in and found that there was 3 other children besides Mary in the house. There were 3 photos on the wall of a boxer. "Who's that?" John asked. "That's Pop," all the kids answered in chorus. "He used to be the light heavyweight champ," said the older boy. "Pop's strong," Mary added. "You might as well know," the mother said. "Your congregation don't want us, and we sure don't want them. They all think my husband is no good." The door swung open, and a large man stood in the doorway. "You that summer reverend?" "Yes, I'm John," and before he could finish, the man motioned with his thumb for John to go out, even though the thunderstorm was still occurring. So it was a surprise to John next Sunday that Frank Sanders was clean-shaven and sitting in the back pew of the church, alone. Since that brief encounter in the thunderstorm, John had asked around about him. Emily, the wife, earned the money for the family by washing clothes. Frank hunted and fished, but spent most of his time with his lone friend, who everybody called Dr. Tom. He was an atheist. The old professor kept Frank in whiskey as payment for running errands for him. After service, everybody in the congregation left quietly except Frank and the pastor. They all waited outside, though, thinking there was going to be a fight. "Mr. Sanders, you're welcome here," said John. "Don't get any ideas, Reverend. I don't believe in any pious balderdash." "That sounds more like Dr. Tom talking than you. Why did you come, Frank?" "You want people to come to your service? Well, you'll get them. Because I'll be here every Sunday, and people will come to see whether I hit you or plead with you to have myself saved from my sins." "Why are you doing this?" "For the nice help you gave our Mary in the rain. When I ordered you out of my house, I didn't know, so I've got to square myself." And then he got up and left whistling and went off towards Dr. Tom's. The church did have its biggest crowds that summer. And eventually it wasn't just Frank alone in the back pew, but it was his whole family that came. Later on, John learned that Frank had been sober for over a month, and had even gotten a job at a planing mill. One morning, John was stopped in front of the general store by a red-whiskered man with a bottle in his hand. "Look, Rev," Dr. Tom panted, "if I can fill this with water, can you change it into good hard liquor?" Well, there was no answer, and he turned to Frank, who had just come out of the store. "Has he got you believing in miracles like changing water into wine?" "I can tell you a bigger miracle," Frank said, smiling, "turning rum into food and clothing, and my miserable home into a happy one." "Balderdash," Dr. Tom yelled. "I'll tell you, Rev, what will happen. Immediately after you leave, he will quit his job. Immediately he'll junk his family, and he'll come back to my way of living." "And you consider that a good thing?" he asked. And in a huff, Dr. Tom turned and waddled off, then yet called back, "Ask Frank what he'll be doing on Christmas Eve." Frank had a deep worry in his eyes. "I don't know if I can stick it out after you're gone. This is a lot tougher fight for me than maybe you realize." "Listening to you keeps me going," Frank said. "You're like my trainer in the corner, my second. You keep up my nerve." "We all have somebody," John said with a capital S, "in our corner. You can count on him. You can't see him, though. He ain't got skin on. I won't be able to see him next Christmas Eve." John had known that every Christmas Eve all the men in town board the train for the county seat to buy presents for the children. And for the last 5 years, Frank has drank away all of the money that was there for presents. "Frank, if you can keep going steady, I'll come back for Christmas Eve to see you through." "It's a deal," he said. Well, summer ended, and back in seminary in the fall, John got a note from Emily, said Frank was doing good. He even wants to make pews for the church, but the only hardwood was in Dr. Tom's property, and he refused to sell unless Frank would take a drink with him, and which he hadn't done at the time. The year went by quickly. John arrived for Christmas Eve, but unfortunately a little late, and Frank had already left for the county seat. He had to wait with Emily on the train platform. What would they see when the train arrived? Emily said the train home was the worst because everyone has a bottle to pass around. "Pray hard, Reverend," she said. The train arrived. There's no Frank. John looked on every car. Eventually, when he got off the last one, yelled, "Has anyone seen Frank Sanders?" "Sure," the engineer said. "I saw him going into the Blue Nose Tavern." John and Emily just bowed their heads and started to walk off. At that time, a wagon full of casks and barrels from the Blue Nose Tavern came up, and off jumped Frank with a handful of children's Christmas toys. "Don't be scared, Emily. I haven't had a drop. Thought this was safer than the train. Less temptation." "Reverend, you came. Thanks. And yet you were right. There was somebody in my corner all the time. Knowing that fixes everything. Come home and help us to trim the tree." There was a fight with outward circumstances concerning drinking, but there was a deeper battle where Frank's soul was being harmed. The young minister was an instrument so that Jesus' word of grace could prepare Frank for this deeper conflict. Yes, we are in the midst of a battle today, but it's not just the outward circumstances of the pandemic. There's a deeper battle going on where we in the church ask, what harm is being done to people's souls? And as we then ask to become God's instruments, let us with spiritual courage spend sufficient time to whomever is harmed so that those souls could be prepared for the conflict. Let us speak openly for the Lord, so that the Lord's words may be heard in the very depths of their souls.